Luke chapter 7 and Matthew chapter 8. We're looking at, in this particular lesson, only 3, which I thought was odd. If you read the lesson, the author of the lesson said, we're going to study Luke 7 because it records 4 things and Matthew doesn't record these things. And I got to thinking, wait a minute. You know, he talks about 4 things, and then he only, like 4 miracles, and then he only mentions 2. And the truth of the matter is there's actually more in Matthew 8 than there is in Luke chapter 7. So that was kind of a head scratcher for me. And so, but it really doesn't, it doesn't matter. We're going to study both chapters as we make our way through this text. Now, in Luke chapter 7, what we have is a time when Jesus has gone to the city of Capernaum. And then later he will go to the city of Nain, which is, your lesson says it's 20 miles. It's actually about 25 miles south of Capernaum to Nain. And you say, well, what's the difference in 20 and 25 miles? Well, anybody that's ever run a marathon can tell you that. Because if you've trained for a marathon, the first 20 miles are a piece of cake, but the last 6.2 are the devil. They talk about hitting the wall. So, well, what's the difference? Well, Jesus wasn't running a marathon. Well, no, but he was walking. Would you rather walk 20, if somebody told you 20 miles and you set out walking and it was 25, you might wonder about that a little bit. And so the city of Nain is where we'll study about Jesus raising the only son of the widow, and then we'll talk about John the Baptist and his reaching out to Jesus from prison. And then there's another text here in Luke 7 that the author completely omits, and it's one of my favorite texts in all the Bible, and I think it's one of the most important brief texts in all of the Bible, and we'll talk about it there shortly in Luke 7 and verses 29 and 30. But looking at Luke 7 and Matthew 8. Now, Matthew 8 follows the Sermon on the Mount. Luke 7 follows the Sermon on the Plain. The Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And then Matthew 8 begins a litany. All the way, Matthew 8 and 9 is a litany of miracles where Jesus showed his authority essentially over every single thing. His authority over sickness, his authority over demons, his authority over nature. I mean, anything wherein Jesus might exert authority, those things are listed here almost all of them in Matthew 8 and 9. Luke 7 records one thing that Matthew does not, and that's the widow at Nain, and that is the raising of the dead, and which is the first recorded raising of the dead that we find at the hands of Jesus in his life and ministry. So now, looking at the account of the centurion's servant, and this is in Luke chapter 7 and verses 1 through 10. Now, the author of the lesson makes a good point, and one that certainly is worthy of our consideration as we think about biblical integrity, or the textual integrity of the Scriptures. And that is that Luke and Matthew describe the same event in two very different ways. And what I mean by that is, when you read Matthew's account of the centurion's servant, it appears as though that the centurion himself has come to Jesus and requested him to heal his servant. Whereas Luke's account tells us that the centurion sent a servant out to meet Jesus. That there were actually 2 groups of people. If we think about it, there are 2 groups of people in Luke's account that are encouraging Jesus to do this thing for the centurion. Because they said, he loves our nation. He built us a synagogue. This man is, and I like the way it says that he is, that he was worthy. He's worthy to do this. In other words, he's a good man. And then Jesus decides he's going to go to that place. And as in Luke's account, as he draws near to the house, a servant is sent out of the house telling Jesus, look, you don't have to come into the house. Just say the word. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. So how would we square up Matthew's account with Luke's account? And one is that Luke was writing. First of all, Luke was writing to a singular individual. He was writing to Theophilus, and he was writing to a man who was quite familiar with Roman life and with the Roman government. Not that the Jews were not, but he wrote from that perspective. And Matthew just simply wrote from a matter of authority. A matter of authority. In other words, everything that the centurion did through his servants was spoken of as if it was him, as if it was the centurion that did it. It's like the example given in the text is, if he says, if I call someplace and leave a message with a receptionist for someone, and the receptionist hands that person my message, it's understood that the message came from me and not from the receptionist. In other words, the authority is in me, and the receptionist is just the carrier or the medium, the intercessor, so to speak. And it wouldn't be right for me to say, well, I'm doing this because let's just say John sends me a message through Tammy, and it wouldn't be right for me to say, well, now Tammy told me to do this. Now Tammy did tell me to do it, right? But what's the authority? What would be the authority behind the statement? The authority behind the statement is John. And so I wouldn't go to the trouble of saying, now Tammy told me, or John told me to do this, but actually he told Tammy to tell me to do this. You see, it's perfectly legitimate for me to say, John told me to do this, even though he sent his word by a messenger, so to speak. And so the same thing is here. It's perfectly legitimate for Matthew to say that everything that we read about is what the centurion said. The centurion sent for Jesus to come heal his servant. The centurion sent a servant to tell Jesus not to come, that he didn't need to come under his roof, but simply say the word and his servant would be healed. And so in that sense, everything that we read about, even though the centurion himself was not present, it all goes back to him as the authority. Whereas Luke gives us the details. Matthew doesn't give us the details. Luke gives us the details. And so the two accounts, they're not contradictory to one another. But this, and the reason I'm spending some time on this is the kind of foolish argument that Bible infidels would throw up and say, well, see, these two accounts, they're not even the same. Matthew says that the centurion did it, and Luke says that the servant did it. And obviously it's not a contradiction. But these are the types of things that people throw up with regard to, the Bible can't be inspired because their stories don't even match up. And that's just not in this particular case, not in any of them, but in this particular case, it's just not a reasonable argument against the integrity of the Scriptures. Now, I want to get to in the text here of the lesson under this section on the centurion's servant is healed. And down at the about the fourth or fifth paragraph, it says, here is a question. Okay? Are we all there? Here is a question. Why did Jesus say, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel? What actions or attitudes or actions did the centurion show to warrant such a claim? And by the way, I don't agree with anything that's in the lesson. I don't think any of these things is the reason. Now, obviously when you say, why do you think, that leaves it up to our opinions, right? And so, one opinion's just as good as the other. But I don't think the reasons that are offered here are very good. First of all, Perhaps it's the fact that he asked Jesus to heal his servant. As a centurion, he could have given the order saying, "Bring Jesus to me." And when Jesus arrived, he could have ordered Jesus to heal his servant. That didn't make any sense at all to me. Jesus never took orders from anybody with regard to healing anyone, right? Did anybody ever order Jesus to do a miracle and Jesus complied with that? But even then, she didn't order it. But that's the closest thing, John. That's the closest thing. And what a bull.
He refused, and then he said whatever she says, or whatever.
Yeah, whatever he tells you. Yeah, and she was simply, and I don't want to use the word playing, but you understand the terminology. She was simply playing on the fact that she knew that Jesus was, first of all, her son, and number two, that even though he was an adult, he still had an obligation. He still had an obligation to his mother, and he also understood that his mother was concerned that the master of the house is in a bind, and he's going to be embarrassed. There's a lot of other things here, and that his mother knew he could do it. He'd never performed a miracle before. This is the first miracle we ever read about that Jesus performed, and she knew he could do it. Whatever he says to you, whatever he tells you to do, do it.
Because that's good for both sides, really.
Yeah.
People got to see.
Yeah. Yeah, and the people that filled the water pots knew what happened. He said, nobody at the feast knew what happened. It says, but the servants that filled the water pots knew what happened.
There's no doubt that Jews of that day, the ordinary everyday people knew exactly who Jesus was supposed to be. And he had power to do what and could.
Mm-hmm. But his mother.
But they feared the Pharisees.
Right.
More.
Right. And so Jesus wouldn't have fallen under compulsion to do a miracle. And just by way of example, if you read Matthew chapter, not Matthew, but Luke chapter 23 and verse 8, when Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, the Bible says that Herod hoped to see some miracle performed by him. Now, Jesus didn't do it, but Herod even understood, even as the king, he didn't have the authority to tell that man to do a miracle.
Well, something always baffled me, or interested me, whatever, the disciples knew exactly. They'd seen him do numerous things they couldn't even imagine. Yet, close to the end, they said, "When are you going to show us the Father?"
Yeah.
Like, have I not done enough? That's
Right.
what he said.
Yeah. Have I been with you so long?
Yeah. Don't know who I am.
Yeah, Philip, if I've been with you so long that you don't know who I am and who I represent. But I want to give you the reason why. I'm going to tell you why I think that Jesus said this. And it's also found not only in this text, and first of all, the reason is found in the statement. I have not found such great faith, no, not even in Israel. Now, when he said in Israel, did he mean the physical borders of Israel, or did he mean something else?
I think he meant in the heart of it.
He meant the people.
Yeah.
In other words, among all the people that live in Israel, in other words, Jews, I have not found such faith among my people. Because then he follows it up. Again, let's go back to Matthew's account. In Matthew 8, Jesus makes it clear. He says, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus explains to us why he said that. In other words, this man is a Roman soldier. He is a Gentile. And this man has exhibited greater faith in Jesus than any of the people that grew up with Jesus, that had known Jesus, that had heard Jesus personally. And then you have a second reason, another reason I think this is also true. And
Because it was faith only.
what?
I don't mean to say it that way, but because it was because of faith.
Yeah, his faith.
He believed that it was possible.
Right. Now, think about...
He hadn't seen.
And think about Mark 7 with the Canaanite woman who kept chasing after Jesus and his disciples. My daughter is demon possessed. Heal her. My daughter, just chased Jesus and the disciples. Chased them everywhere, trying to get him to, And of course, Jesus made the statement, it's not fit to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. And she said, true, Lord, but even the dogs desire the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And he said, woman, great is your faith. It shall be done for you as you have wished. But the Bible is clear. It says she was a Syro-Phoenician. She was not a Jew. So in other words, two of the people in the life and ministry of Jesus who exhibited the greatest faith in him were two people who were not of Jewish descent. That's why I think, and again, Matthew's account makes it clear. I have not found such faith among the Israelites, and people who are not Israelites are going to come from east and west. It means they're going to come from all over, and they're going to sit down in the kingdom. In other words, Gentiles are going to sit down in the kingdom with Abraham and Isaac, and the Jews are going to find themselves shut out. And that's exactly what happened. So I think that's the reason Jesus said what he did. I think the text bears that out for us. And then you have toward the bottom. Well, let's just go to the next page because the lesson kind of changes gears with respect to that Jesus, is concerned with us in times of sickness. But then he's also now talking about there's a transition in the lesson and a transition from Capernaum to Nain, that now he's concerned with not only people's physical health, he's concerned with the matter of death. By the way, just as a quick aside, does anybody know what Capernaum means? What does Capernaum mean? It means the house of Nahum. In other words, Capernaum was named after was called such because that's where the prophet Nahum was from, the city of Nahum. Now, the widow's son in Luke 7:11 through 17. It says, now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain. In other words, he walked 25 miles from Capernaum to Nain. And many of his disciples went with him in a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. All right, so we have now Jesus raising this woman's son, which is an interesting miracle to me in view of what so-called modern faith healers claim. When they fail, it's the other person. It's the sick person's fault. You don't have enough faith. All right. Well, let me ask you. Let me riddle you something here, Batman. Who had faith in this account? Did anybody come ask Jesus to heal that boy, raise him from the dead? Did his mama ask him? Yeah, she's following behind, weeping, has no idea what's going to happen. What about the guys that were carrying the coffin? Did they have faith? We've talked about recently about the in Mark's account where the friends let that man, they tore off a roof and let that man down, and the Bible says that Jesus saw their faith and not the faith of the paralytic. All right, so were the guys bearing the coffin of the same faith of the guys that let down the paralytic? Nope. Were they walking and one of them say, "Hey, look, there's Jesus. He can solve this problem for us if you'll just..." No. Well, did the dead boy have faith?
This was purely compassion on the Lord.
Pure compassion on the part of the Lord.
That's it.
Pure compassion on the part of the Lord. By the way, the only time we read in the Bible where somebody failed to perform a miracle, Jesus said it was the fault of the performer and not the one making the request. Remember the man that had the demon-possessed son? And he said, "I brought him to your disciples and they could not cast him out." That tells you he had faith, because he brought his son to the disciples because he believed they could heal him. And they couldn't heal him. And then they asked Jesus after he healed him, "Why could we not heal him?" He said, "Because you don't have enough faith." He said, "You don't have enough faith." It wasn't the boy's fault, and it wasn't the boy's daddy's fault, it was their fault. All right? So just as an aside, when it comes to healings and faith, we want to be clear about what the Bible says and not about what the world says and what they might say. And so you have this particular account, and verse 16 says, "Fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people.'" Now, I want to note a couple of things here in this text. And this won't mean a lot to some of you, but matter of fact, it may not mean anything to any of you. But about 30 years ago, Hugo McCord released a translation of the New Testament. It's called The Everlasting Gospel. And it's published, and you can buy a copy of it. In fact, there are some secular, when I say secular, I mean non-church related Bible software people who have his translation included in their package. That's how good it is, okay? And McCord translated John 3:16, rather than saying his only begotten son, I think it says his unique son. His unique son, and not his only begotten son. And a bunch of our brethren lost their ever-loving minds over this. And they slammed McCord as not believing in the divinity of Jesus and made all types of just foolish charges, except there's a problem with their charge. The phrase "only begotten" in John 3:16 is the same phrase "only son" in Luke 7 and verse 12. It's the same phraseology. This was the only begotten son of this woman. It's the only son she had. He was unique. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that all this hullabaloo over Brother McCord was first of all was foolish, because are we also not the sons of God? Have we not been begotten? But does not the Bible say that we've all been begotten by God? All Christians are begotten by God. We're all the sons of God. And so McCord got it right. In other words, Jesus was a son in a unique sense. He was the Son of God in a unique sense that none of us share. All right, and so just thinking about, I'm just thinking about this language and.
Just that statement, unique son, doesn't mean he has multiple or only one. It just says it's one to him.
Yeah, he's one of a kind. A thing that's unique is a one of a kind. That's what the word unique means. It means one of a kind. And Jesus was the one of a kind Son of God. God has many sons. The Bible says Jesus died to bring many sons to glory. All right, so he has many sons, but he's only got one that's like Jesus. All right, and so this phraseology, this woman, this was her only son, this only child that she had. But I want to note down in verse 16. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. Now, the word fear is the word for awe. In other words, this word is like so many others in our New Testament that its usage is determined by its context. Sometimes this word fear might be scared. Sometimes it might be reverence. And sometimes it just might mean awestruck. Okay? So when it says they feared, it didn't mean, it wasn't in the same sense that the people feared when Jesus sent 2,000 hogs into the sea. That's a different kind of fear altogether. All right? They were filled with awe at what they had witnessed. Okay? But then note the two phrases that are here. What's the first phrase in verse 16 to describe Jesus? What is it? A great prophet has risen up among us. Now, I can't remember which one of his sermons it is. I think it's Panorama of the Prophets, Part 1. Johnny Ramsey had a series called the Panorama of the Prophets, where he preached a sermon on an overview of all the major prophets in one sermon, and then 2 sermons on each first 6 and last 6 of the minor prophets. And in Matthew 16 and verse 16, or verse 13, Jesus' disciples came, to the coast of Caesarea Philippi, and he said, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" Now this is Johnny Ramsey talking, all right? "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" They said, "Some say that you're Jeremiah, you're John the Baptist, you're one of the prophets." And Johnny said, "What a compliment to the prophets." People thought they were complimenting Jesus by comparing him to the prophets, and Johnny said, "No, that's a compliment to the prophets." That's right. And so the point here is this. Jesus wasn't just a prophet. Even witnessing what they had witnessed, they still, in spite of being awestruck by seeing this young man raised from the dead and being filled with awe, they still fell short of identifying Jesus. You see what I'm saying? They simply referred to him as a prophet. A great prophet has risen up among us.
That's all they wanted to describe to him.
Yeah, all they would describe to him was to be a prophet.
Jesus must be a prophet.
It's like, and Jesus said later in this text and in Matthew's text about John the Baptist, what did you go out to see when you went to see John the Baptist? A prophet? He said, more than a prophet. More than a prophet. And so even filled with awe, people still fall short of ascribing Jesus all the glory and honor that's due him. They called him no more than a prophet. Secondly, the phrase, the Lord has what? Visited his people. Very interesting word here as well. A very common word that is oftentimes misunderstood and misused. By the way, and I say that because I think somebody misused this word in one of my Facebook posts in making a comment about how the church has failed to visit the widows. In other words, things the church has not done well is they failed to visit the widows. But what she meant was nobody just goes and sits a spell with them. But that's not what the word visited here means. It doesn't mean just to go sit a spell. Just to go sit down and talk or chat and share a cup of coffee or a sandwich. The word here is almost identical to the word for overseer, the word for elder. Elder is episkopos, and this is a form of that word. But episkopos means to oversee. But what is implied in the work of an elder as one who oversees? Is he just watching? Is that all he's doing? Is an elder simply a casual observer? All right, he takes care of them and he sees to their needs. That's the word here. The Lord has visited his people. He's visited his people. It's found, I wrote down some of them. For example, in Matthew 25, in verses 36 and 37, I was in prison and you, what? Visited me. Visited me. That's the same word as here, and the Lord has visited his people. Now, again, we have a misunderstanding. We have a misunderstanding about what it means to visit in this sense. I'll give you an example. When Wayne was still living and in prison, I would go and visit him. Visit him. I drove over to St. Clair Correctional Facility and went in there, and he would come out. We sat at a table, and I'd get him I'd buy him a Dr. Pepper and a ham sandwich out of the vending machine, and we'd sit and eat a sandwich and drink Dr. Pepper and just chat, just talk. Hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it was, and then it'd be time for me to leave, and I'd leave. All right? Now we might say, well, I visited him in prison. And in some sense, that'd be right. But during the course of his confinement, every 3 months, he would mail me a sheet of paper where food stuff could be bought so that he didn't have to eat the garbage that they were serving him in prison every day. And you could buy a certain amount of money's worth of food, Vienna sausages, coffee, mustard, ketchup, ramen noodles. I mean, there was like 200 or 300 items, and they all had a price. And Wayne would take that sheet and he would mark on that sheet everything that he wanted every 3 months. And every 3 months I would go online and order that food, and it would be shipped to him, and he could get it when he needed it in prison. About every 6 months or so, every year, Wayne would say, "It's time to buy shoes again," or "It's time, I can get I need a blanket, I need new shoes, I need a sweater or sweatshirt, some item." All right, I'd go online and get him whatever it was that he needed. Now, both of those things were extremely important to him, right? The personal visit. But really, the other things that were done for him is visiting him in the true sense of the word. In other words, providing the things that he needed. Now, if you want to go back to the first century and talk about being in prison there, that's what's being talked about. People didn't get 3 squares in prison in the first century. People didn't have air conditioning and heat in the first century. People didn't have medical care in prison in the first century. You see, they didn't have books to read. Paul was in prison, and he told Timothy, "Bring my books, bring my books." They didn't have a library in first century prison. So in order to visit a man in the first century, you went and you found out what that man needed, and you brought it to him. That's the idea of visiting here. And so when the Bible says here that the people are saying the Lord has visited his people, here's what they're really saying. the Lord has looked down on us and has took notice of what we need, and He has provided it. So much more in this word than sometimes we want to take time to dig a little bit, and to think about. In James 1:27 it says, "Visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction." It's not talking about just going sitting and chatting with the widows, although I'm sure that they would enjoy that from time to time. But it means to make sure that none of the widows are in need. If there's something that needs to be done at their house, if there's something that needs to be done outside, make sure that those things are noticed, and make sure that those things are done. That's the word here. The Lord has visited His people. And so, but then also this, note that verse 16 says that in response to what was done, they glorified God. Ultimately, every miracle performed in the Bible is done to glorify God. It brings God on. It takes our attention and puts it on God. It takes our weaknesses and gets us to focus on the strength and the power of God. And so they glorified God, even though they came up short in describing Jesus. But then again, lastly, they recognize the Lord has provided for us. He's looked down on us, and He's provided for us what we need, and has visited His people. All right, next, Lord willing, next Sunday we'll start in the section on John the Baptist. There's not. I think we've already had one bell, right?